Hello and welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nichols.
And today's show, we're talking about how to retire on just $19,000. And the reason we're talking about this is recently there was a New Zealand Herald column by Mary Holm, who is one of New Zealand's most trusted journalists. And she was actually talking about one of our articles. And the headline was, do I really need to save $1.45 million for retirement? And this person who had written it to Mary had said, hey, look, I've been on the Opus website, read some of their articles, and the largest figure that we'd given within a range was, about $1.5 million. And Mary made some really interesting points and actually brought my attention to an report that came out from by the way, don't click off this because this is actually very interesting, but what I'm about to say is very, very boring. It's a report from the Society of Actuaries. Now, do you remember...
I can't believe you missed a report by these guys. I thought you were speaking at their conference.
Well, no, it's because I wish. I mean, I would love that kudos because remember, actuaries are like the nerdiest of number
the
crunchers.
Nerdy version of Ed.
And let me just get a second pair of glasses to put on. I need to be a six
Some
size.
braces.
Yeah, I need a 6 size, not a 4 eyes. And the reason I missed this was the report came out in December. So about 2 months ago.
And you'd clocked out. You were already planning your trip to Europe.
Yeah, I was, and I was on holiday. And so I was actually very, very happy that Mary brought this up. And Andrew, there was a really interesting takeaway from their report when it comes to retirement.
So they looked at what people were actually spending in retirement, but how it slowed down over time, or they spent less over time, because as you get older, you might spend less on things because you're maybe not going out as much, you're maybe not traveling to Europe as often. So maybe you don't need as much money as what we might budget for in our modelling.
It's because then your hips buggered and you can't get out when you're 90.
That's basically you're describing you now.
Or your mate's unfortunately passed away.
Why
so
are
you don't
pointing at me?
Because you're going to die well before me. Rather than sharing a beer in retirement, it's just going to be me with my own one because you're not going to be around anymore. Which actually, when I think about that, that's going to make me very sad. Because statistically, before we even take into account your poor lifestyle choices, you're going to die 8 years before me. Now, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, Andrew's on the floor at the moment. He's laughing at the reality.
I was drowned to death.
Well, you shouldn't have been sipping your water while I'm making very important points about New Zealand's financial future. Now, come back and record this podcast with me. So the big takeaway from that report was that people tend to reduce their spending over time by 2% in real terms. Now, this is very important, right? So let's say that inflation is running at 2.5%. And people are reducing their inflation-adjusted spending by 2% a year. They could still be spending a little bit more each year, but their spending isn't keeping up with inflation. So they're buying less stuff on average. Now, this becomes really important because it might mean that you need 40% less money than some of the figures that we've previously talked about. And the good news is because this research has come out, we can now talk about that and say, actually, if you're really close to retirement, if you're 63 right now and you're like, maybe I've left my retirement planning a bit late, this is going to make you feel really, really good and be like, okay, maybe I don't need as much as I thought I might need.
Now, is it 2% steadily from the age of 65, or does it, increase and then peter off? And does it rely on someone retiring at 65?
That's a very good question, right? And so, because effectively what you're saying is, okay, I'm 65, I retire. Well, I'm still good. My hip's still okay. All my friends are around. Maybe I really ramp up my spending and then I reduce it once I hit 65. It's not in the numbers. We don't have that. Some countries as well, they reduce their spending at a slower rate. So it might be 1%. Some other studies have it reducing at a higher rate. But I'll show you what that really means because, of course, I pulled out a spreadsheet and started looking at it. But let's say that you want to start by spending $100,000 a year, right? That's what you want to spend. Over time, you're going to start reducing it. So if you start at 65, by the time you are, let's call it 80, you're going to be spending roughly $70,000 or $72,000 a year in real terms. So rather than buying $100,000 worth of stuff, by the time you're 80, you're now buying 72 grand's worth of stuff. By the time you're 100 years old, you've kind of halved your spending, again, in real terms. So rather than spending $100K a year like you were when you were 65, you're now spending $50,000 a year. So that kind of gives you a bit of a sense. Now, it's important to say this won't be what everybody does, right? Because some people are going to spend a lot of money on healthcare. Some people are going to end up giving a lot of money away to charity. Or you might be in really good health and you are living your best life right the way till you're 90. That can all happen. This is just what we're seeing on average. And most retirement models have us thinking, actually, you're just going to spend, in this case, if you start out spending $100K a year when you're 65, you're going to keep on spending that money right up until you're 90 years old. You're still spending the equivalent of $100,000. And what the Society of Actuaries, the 6 eyes, are making us think about is maybe you're going to reduce it over time and you can factor this into your retirement plan.
Now, can I ask a question? Does this work on age only on age 65? So if I retire early, would the same apply?
Oh, I wouldn't have thought so. I reckon if you retired at 50, you'd probably ramp up your spending.
That's what I would have thought as well. So again, this might be a consideration. Okay, if I plan to work to 65, that's all well and good. I can now say, all right, well, I am gonna just budget to spend less year on year. But a lot of investors that I talk to today want to retire before 65. It's more and more. I think it's more common that people want to retire before 65, or at least semi-retire before 65, than actually work to 65.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. And what you'd see is those sorts of people probably want to spend more, because I always know that, but Monday to Friday, I don't spend that much money, right?
No,
because
nothing.
I'm at work. Well, it's not nothing. I know you, Andrew Nicol, but I've seen what you order at lunch. But you're spending less over your weekdays. By the time you get to Saturday and Sunday, your weekend, well, you've got all the time in the world, and so you end up spending more. And so I always think that a retirement is just a whole heap of weekends in a row. So certainly when you're young and fit, or you're retiring early, you probably are going to start spending more. But I want to dig into this because if you're 63 right now, I do think that this is going to give you a lot of comfort. So I said at the start, we're going to show you how to retire on $19,000. So if we think about it, the no-frills metro lifestyle that Massey University's report talks about is about $909 a week. That's for a couple, which means that you're spending $47,000 a year. Now, inflation over the last 20-ish years has been about 2.5%. And I've got some other assumptions in here. But let's say that you're a couple, you've got to get New Zealand superannuation. Well, according to the Massey University report, they reckon that you are going to need to have in the bank to top up your superannuation. They say you're going to need, I think it's, have I scrolled past the number? No, I haven't scrolled past the number. They reckon that you're going to need $120,000 in the bank at the time that you retire, you hit 65. That's to top up your super.
That's a lot less than I imagined.
Well, that's if you're just on that no frills lifestyle.
Right.
You're only needing to go a little bit up. And again, this assumes that you're going to keep on spending that $909 a week for basically the rest of your life. But under the Nerdy Number Crunchers model, you're actually going to reduce your spending over time, right? So you're going to start out there and you're going to spend less and you're going to spend less and you're going to spend less. Well, they reckon that instead of that kind of $113,000 by my numbers, you might only need $18,000 in your bank account to live that lifestyle. And that is because we are assuming that you are going to spend less and less and less each year. And so you could retire with just that $19,000 in your bank account. You're looking very skeptical.
Yeah, I am. And I'll tell you why, because there's only so far that you can strip your budget back. So I'm thinking, okay, well, my rates on my house are going to always cost me a similar amount. My insurance is going to cost me the same amount. I'm sure I can maybe adjust, how many times I go out for dinner, but can I do it that much?
Well, I think
how much is the discretionary part of my spend? Not a lot.
Okay, I've got a story for you that I want to tell you in a second. But the reason that number is really, really low is that you've got to remember about what happens with New Zealand Super. So we are assuming that you are reducing your spending over time, but because the cost of things are going up, and you might spend a little bit more, but your spending isn't keeping up with inflation. But New Zealand Super is being adjusted. In fact, it's adjusted for the average change in how much workers are taking home. And so at the start, under this model, New Zealand Super is making up 88% of how much you can spend, but by the time you get to age 72, you're just living on that NZ Super. So that 19 grand that you retire with as a couple only has to last you those first 6 or 7 years within retirement under this modelling.
Right, because I remember we had this conversation before. New Zealand Super tends to go up by that, say, 4% a year compared to inflation at 2.5% in this example, right?
And in this case, your spending's not keeping up with inflation. And so once you get to 80, you're basically just living off that. And it actually reminded me of my own grandfather. Because I remember that my mum was telling me a story when we were discussing like superannuation and things like this, because that's what we do at the dinner table sometimes. And she said that she was having a conversation with him, and he said to her, "Do you know how much the government gives me for NZ Super each week?" And she's like, "No." And at that stage, it was probably like $400. He was $400 a week. And she's like, "Okay, what do you think of that?" He's like, "That's heaps. That's heaps." Because you've got to remember, at the time, my grandfather was probably like late 70s, early 80s. We lived in Hawera. I think he'd sold his car at this point. He had his mobility scooter. He's actually living in one of those sausage flats.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
And so I think it was like 4 or 5 flats with, all the oldies. Typically,
he was probably having a great life.
Well, no, he was hiding. I mean, I think he did have a good life, but he was hiding from the lady next door who was kind of into him. He's like, "No, I'm not interested in talking
you
to
McKnights, you've always had the charm."
Well, he had an Irish accent, so he sounded much, much nicer than me. But if I think about what his life looked like, he'd go to the library, get lots of nice free books. He'd read. He had his magnifying glass out. He still smoked a couple of ciggies. And
really, back when you could afford those.
Well, yeah. The thing about the taxes were much lower there. He used to smoke a pipe, but I think unfortunately, when my grandmother got really sick with breast cancer, I think he took that stopped doing that quite as much.
Right.
But from what I could tell, his life was very simple, but he enjoyed that life. And so what I'm trying to get across, and I think this is what Mary is trying to say in her column as well. If you ramp down your spending, after a while, once you hit 73, 74, maybe New Zealand Super is going to be enough for you, and you're going to be very happy. But I also want to tell you, I know I'm rabbiting on, but here we go.
It's funny.
I'll tell you another story. Because there are some people who still want to, even live their best life up until 90. So do you remember, I'm going to talk about my ex-girlfriend.
Yep.
And
who are you talking about?
Yeah, you're smiling now. You're like,
this is going to be good.
You're like, which one of the two? And she was an opera singer. Probably still is. Don't know. Haven't Googled her.
Reach out.
No. And so she worked for a company, great company, that did like tours, like travel for older people, kind of 65 pluses. And they were like musical tours, and, oldies would go there, if I can use that term, and, they'd sing for them. And it was such a wonderful thing, because then all of these, elderly people or retirees could go around with people who are a similar age and have a nice time and travel around New Zealand and, in fact, the world. Like some of those trips, they'd go over to Europe for 4 weeks. It was really good. Now, I was very lucky. I went on one of these tours.
Yeah, I remember we had to do a bulk podcast recording.
Yeah, we boxed them all out. And I went on a tour to Napier. And I think it probably cost these people like $4 grand, maybe to $6 grand to go on this trip for, I don't know, a week or so. And I remember being on the bus with a lady who was in her 90s, and her name was Joy. And she'd come on this trip by herself. And I said, "Joy, talk to me about, what you've been doing over the last 25 years that you haven't been working." And it was really sweet. She said to me that she, when she was 65, her husband had died, and she went on a cruise, and she met the next love of her life when she was in her late 60s.
Joy.
Yeah, and she was actually quite grumpy at this stage.
Yeah, because she's been married twice.
And she and I said, what was it about this guy that you really liked? And he said, he would take me dancing. She was like, he just changed my life. It was amazing. We had this wonderful second marriage, and he would take me dancing, and I really, really loved that.
And did he die as well?
Unfortunately, I think he just had. And so Joy was here on this trip by herself, and she was a bit of a grump.
No wonder.
But I remember at one of these big dinners, everybody starts getting up and dancing, and Joy's sitting there by herself.
Oh,
So I went over. I'm like, "Come on, Joy, I'm taking you dancing."
You have a heart.
And so we went off, and we had a great time. Now, the reason I bring this up is like Joy was probably not just living on the superannuation. If you're spending money on these kinds of things, and so there are just different types of lifestyles that people want when they are in their later years in life. And so I always just think, okay, you might want to ramp down your spending, but you might want to ramp it up as well. I mean, there was another couple that I met when I was down in Doubtful Sound on another trip, which is down in Fiordland. It was absolutely great. We went on this big, expensive ship. It was good because it was during COVID times, and so there weren't as many tourists in New Zealand, which meant it was actually a lot cheaper to travel. And there was this couple who I met. I won't say their names, actually. I feel, just in case.
What, you're worried that the oldies are listening to your podcast?
No, it's because I'm going to talk about this lovely couple. They lived in quite a nice suburb in Auckland, and I was like, okay, well, what was your life like? And they were just on normal incomes. They lived in St Heliers, and they were both scientists. And is that too much personal identifying information?
No, I don't think so.
And they bought a property, and then they bought one or two properties, and they sold it and made some really good money off it. And that was how they used to fund these trips. And this trip down to Doubtful Sound was like around Queenstown and stuff. It was probably $6,000 to $8,000. Actually, for two of them, it would have been more than that. It was quite expensive.
A big chunk of their New Zealand super if they were just relying on that.
Now, what's important to mention is that they were using that money still to be able to go on these really nice trips. But it doesn't mean that they were wasteful. So I remember saying, there's a great cinema right, in your area that I like to go to. It's Silky Otter in Oraki, right, which is really close to where I currently live. I love that cinema. And they're like, no, we don't go there because that's more expensive. We like to go and get the senior discount at the Mission Bay Cinema in Auckland because on Tuesdays we get a special discount with our Super Gold card, which is great. So you can still be, careful with money and not living a lavish lifestyle, but still keep money aside for those really important things. And so I just always think when it comes to some of these things we're talking about and me saying, hey, good news, maybe you only need 19 grand in your bank account rather than the 110K or 120K that Massey University's numbers might say you need. You also just want to think about that quality of life. And do you really want to ramp down? Some people will be quite happy with that. Some people are going to want a little bit more, like Joy and some of these other people that I've told you about.
And I think there's two big takeaways for investors listening to this. So if you are listening to this and you're getting closer to retirement, you're in your 60s and maybe it's looming and you haven't done as much as maybe you would have liked to have done if you had your time again to prepare for retirement. I'm sure that is quite a daunting experience thinking about that. And we throw out numbers like, $1 million or $2 million or whatever you need to have. And you might think, well, I've only got 50,000 in my KiwiSaver. I cannot mathematically do that. I'm screwed. That would be quite depressing. So now what you can do is start to think, okay, well, maybe how do I actually just use my money and adjust my lifestyle as time goes on to be able to make the money that I have got work or the investments that I have got work? On the flip side, you might also be miles away from retirement and you might think, you know what? I don't want to adjust my lifestyle. I don't want to have to think about adjusting my lifestyle. Surely it might happen, but I don't want to have to budget for that. I don't want to have to worry about going to one cinema over another. I want to just be able to spend money, and if I've got surplus, great, I'll leave that to my kids. I'll create that generational wealth. Then you can use these figures to motivate yourself to know, okay, well, I should have more than enough so that I am creating generational wealth, not just spending on my own lifestyle.
And I think this comes down to who you're talking to. Like if you, and that's kind of why I understand that sometimes the stuff that Mary talks about when she's writing in the Herald is a little bit different from the things that we talk about. Because typically we're speaking to people who have time to prepare for retirement. And so we do want you to be ambitious. And, personally, if I think about it, do I want to ramp down? If I retire at 65, do I want to spend less when I'm 66? No. I want to be able to keep my spending high. In fact, I want to have lots and lots of options. Now, I'm far enough away where that's possible for me. But again, if you're 63, if you're 62, hell, if you are 68 and you're still working and you're worrying about retirement, maybe this gives you a little bit more comfort to say, well, I've got $100,000 in my KiwiSaver. Maybe I can spend a little and enjoy my late 60s, my early 70s. Maybe I can spend more now, knowing that I am going to reduce my spending later. And maybe that gives you some comfort. I would also just say you don't want to fool yourself. So I remember we did a great episode where we looked at the science of saving, right? And we looked at what universities say about how people manage their money. And one of the common fallacies that people fall into is that I'm going to save later. So maybe I'm 30 now and I'm like, okay, I want to save a lot of money. I want to invest a lot of money, but I've got time. I'm 30, so I can afford to be a little bit looser with my spending now. I'll just save later. And then that save later never really comes. So just when you are planning for your retirement as well, you just want to think, okay, maybe I could spend a bit more today because I'm going to spend less later. But you just have to be confident that, yes, you really are going to spend later as well, because you don't want to get there and then be like, okay, I feel like I need to be really worried about, do I turn the heating on or not, because I don't want to run out of money.
And I'll give you 2 examples of clients that I've worked with over the last week that are fresh in my head. There was one couple that I met with, and they are kind of, he's a few years from retirement, she's 6.5 years away from retirement. And they've had a bit of a bad run recently. So they've got 2 properties where they bought right at the peak of the market. They're worth less now than what they paid for them. They will lose money if they sold those properties. They've got some money in KiwiSaver, not a lot, but a little bit. And they are close enough to retirement that they're saying, okay, we're going to get the superannuation. We're pretty confident we're going to get the superannuation. We can rely on that on our numbers. Where we modelled out what their requirements were and using a non-reducing spend, but somewhere between the no frills lifestyle and the choices lifestyle. I think we worked on about 75 grand a year of today's money. They were quite comfortable with their numbers, and actually their existing properties and KiwiSaver, even though they've got to wait for some recovery time there, it was going to get them to their goal. So they're quite happy with that. And they were quite nervous about it before having a conversation with me. On the flip side, just yesterday I met with some people, and they're both 36 at the moment. They already own a rental property. They own their own house, and they've been contributing to KiwiSaver, and they get a pretty good employer contribution. Now, they said, we bought this property right at the peak of the market. We don't think it's gone very well. Should we sell it? We put in the KiwiSaver projections, and we put their property into Opus Plus, our modelling software. They're on track for their 150 grand a year lifestyle. They're already there, like at 65. So what that then allowed them to do is, that was based on the nest egg. Now we've set, which is where you build up your money and then you spend your money. Now what they've said is, okay, if we're already now 100% of the way under the nest egg model, let's go to the golden goose where we just live on the return so we can pass everything on to our kids later on. That only requires a little bit more effort. And so because they've got time on their side, they want to have more options in retirement and create generational wealth. So it's not a one size fits all.
I just want to give you one last scenario before we wrap up. Let's say that you're a little bit more ambitious. You're 65 now, and you want to spend $100,000 a year, which is pretty much like the gold standard that a lot of people aim for, just because it's a big round number. And let's say you're a couple, you're going to get the superannuation, you think you're going to die at 90. The difference between changing, like reducing your spending, so not keeping your spending up with inflation, versus keeping it constant, is about 50%. So if you're going to keep your spending up with inflation, you're going to need to retire with that about $1.2 million in the bank. If you say, actually, we're going to spend less over time, then you're going to need only $800,000 in the bank. So you need 50% more if you are going to keep your spending up with inflation. So again, this could just make you feel a little better about it. The exact kind of multiple about how much more you need if you want your spending to keep up inflation depends on how much you want to spend. Like the less you want to spend, I know this sounds really obvious, but like the even less you need in your bank account. because you are going to assume that NZ Super is going to make up way, way, way more of your overall plan. So you just want to run these numbers with a financial advisor. But I think the good thing about this is I always like it when somebody challenges you, even if it's publicly in the Herald, when when Mary says, hey, you should take a look at this report. And I'm like, actually, yeah, this is very, very interesting. And I'm going to look at how we include some of these numbers, all these options for the investors that we work with. But I think this is something good. If you are 65 and you're really worried about your retirement, this is going to make you feel better. If you are 40 or even 45, 50, I still think you should be a little bit more ambitious so that there is more fat in your budget. And then what that allows you to do as well is, even if you've made or you've saved even more money and you're like, okay, maybe my spending is going to reduce over time, that means you can live it up in your late 60s and your early 70s and have an even better lifestyle. But this is all about choices, about creating a plan, deciding how you want to live. So over the last 20 odd minutes, what have we learned? Why you might not need as much money to retire as you think, how much you might need in some different scenarios, and also what you can do, i.e. invest a bit more so you can live it up when you stop working, because you're going to spend less over time. Let's wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Really does help us get the message out to more people. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you want to see the spreadsheet that we're going through, just Google Opus Partners YouTube. It'll be the first thing that comes up. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We're well on our way to growing this community to 50,000 subscribers. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight.
And I'm Andrew Nicol.
We're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.